This podcast is an introduction to the skeletal system, and you will find everything that I have on the board on the first page of your notes right here. On the back of the skeletal system notes, I have osteogenesis and chondrogenesis, which means to make cartilage and bone, and that will be on a separate podcast with an actual drawing of these two processes. So to get back here, our bones, basically, we have dense bones or we have porous bones. Porous means they have holes in them or spaces. So these are the two types that we have, dense or holy bone, right, or porous. So now we have different terms to describe that the doctors use, describe dense bone or holy bone. So they sort of match up as pairs. So compact bone means very thick and dense, right? And so what's the opposite of compact? Spongy bone. Spongy bone, sponges have holes in them, and so that's the opposite. And all of our bones are made out of both compact and spongy. Different amounts of the two, but we definitely have dense and holy bone, spongy bone. Now, the next set of terms is called cortical bone or medullary bone. Cortical bone means it's underneath the periosteum, okay? Underneath the periosteum on the outside surface of every bone. Very thick, very hard. And then medullary bone means it's in the middle of the bone, found in the bone marrow cavity, okay? So the middle means, medullary means bone marrow cavity. That's where you're gonna find this bone. All right, now the next set of terms is non-cancellous and cancellous. So cancellous means it's got holes in it. Non-cancellous means it's very thick and dense. And then the next set is called non-trabeculated versus trabeculated. So trabeculated means branching, okay? Trabeculated means branching. And so it's got holes in it. It's got branches, it's got spaces between it. So non-trabeculated and trabeculated. These two sets of terms are usually used a lot by the X-ray people. All right, now the next thing we want to talk about are what are the primary organs in the system, in the skeletal system? Well, we just have three. We have bones, okay? That's the major organ in the system. And basically you start out with 350 fetal bones. And then at birth, they fuse together and they become 275 total. And then by age 10 up there, we have 206 to 210. So usually most people say, oh, we've got 206 in our adult skeleton. Well, some people might have 4 extras, and the 4 extras are not extra fingers and toes or whatever. They're actually in the suture lines of your skull, and that's where you will have those 4 extras. So bones is the first primary organ in the system, and then ligaments. Ligaments are made out of simple squamous, ET, and dense rag. And what do ligaments do? They hold bone to bone or bone to cartilage, right? So they're gonna tie them all together. And then the third thing, the primary organ, would be cartilage. And we have 3 specific kinds, hyaline, elastic, fibrous, and we go over those on another podcast just related to cartilage. And then the secondary organs or accessory organs that are gonna help the primaries, we have 5 listed here. And so skeletal muscles help the bones by supporting them and then also by moving them. We have 650 skeletal muscles. Don't worry, we're not learning all those. And then the second thing we have, tendons. Tendons are just like ligaments. They're made out of the exact same thing, simple squamous, ET, dense rag, CT. And what do? They reinforce the joints and the ligaments, essentially between the bones. And then the third thing, blood vessels. Blood vessels bring in the good stuff. The arteries bring in food, oxygen, and hormones. And veins take out the CO2, the waste, and also some hormones, right? And then the fourth thing, nerves, good old nerves. Afferent and efferent going in and out. And what do? For the bones, they control mitosis and blood release from the bone marrow cavity, right? And then the fifth thing, hormone organs. And so we actually have 6 organs that will make hormones that will help both the skeleton and cartilage. And so bones and cartilage, like hormones from the pituitary gland, the hypothalamus, the thyroid, the parathyroid, the ovary, and the testes. And we will go over the hormones involved with both skeleton, both the bones and the cartilage a little bit later, okay? And then the last thing, the ways to classify bones. Well, we've got 5 ways we can use to classify all bones. And so the first one is, in which skeleton do you find the bone? And so the axial skeleton is the main frame. So it goes from your head, your cranium, all the way down through your coccyx, all right? So that's the last vertebrae. And so 80 to 84 would be in the axial skeleton. And then the other skeleton is called appendicular. And so appendicular means the arms and the leg bones, and then the bones associated with the joint. So the pelvis would be in there, the clavicle, the scapula, and so those would all be in the appendicular, okay? Density of the bone. How much thick bone do you have, dense bone versus spongy bone? So it's a ratio of the compact to the spongy. So they just say how much density of the bone. So what's the heaviest bone in the human body? Why, the femur. It has the most compact bone. And what are some of the easiest bones that have the least amount of compact and lots of spongy? Your ribs, easy to break or crack. And so those would be examples of which dominates, the compact or the spongy. And then specific bone markings on the bone themselves help give a clue as to what bone you're looking at. And then fetal bone development, 10% of your bones, which mean your skull bones, develop intramembranous, which means it's actually a loose CT membrane that basically is going to produce all the skull bones. And so skull bones come right from loose CT cells, and they become very hard and mineralized immediately to protect the brain and the spinal cord. All right, and then 90% of your bones develop by endochondral methods, the endochondral growth, and that means they have to come from little bitty hyaline cartilage bones, all right, in the fetus. And then the last thing you can do is you can identify your bones based on their overall shape. And so if you have a long bone, that means it's longer than it is wide. And so long bones would be like your humerus, your radius ulna, femur is the longest bone. And then we have the tibia and the fibula. We also have metatarsals and metacarpals. Those are considered long bones because they're way longer than they are wide. Short bones, basically, they have to be sort of cube shape. So some of your tarsal bones, some of your carpal bones are short bones, and those would be your best areas for those. And then flat bones means they're compressed from the anterior to posterior, sort of like roadkill. And so flat bones, the best one would be the sternum, is considered a flat bone. Ribs sometimes are considered flat bones because they're compressed also. And so those are great ones. And all your skull bones, except for the mandible, all the cranial bones are considered flat bones because they're compressed. And then sutural bones means those are extra little bones growing in the suture lines of your skull. So that's also, they used to call these the wormian bones, but now they just call them sutural bones so that you know where they are. And then the last two terms they use with shape is sesamoid. And so sesamoid means they have to grow inside and stay inside a tendon their entire life. And so the patella is your best example of a sesamoid bone. And then last but not least, anything that doesn't fit these other descriptions is called irregular. So irregular bones, they could be long, they could be flat, they could be short areas on them. And so irregulars, the best example would be your pelvis, your vertebrae are excellent. Scapula is a strange bone. Those would be all great examples of irregulars. So that's the beginning, the introduction to the skeletal system. And now we're going to go on and talk about how they grow, okay, methods of growing or development, and then the hormones that will influence them. All right, we're going to talk about how skull bones actually develop. And so it's called intramembranous growth. So that means it grows from within a membrane, and right here is the membrane. This red outer layer is called Leucete, the Leucete membrane. And what's going to happen is growth hormone comes in with the blood vessels, and growth hormone will make the fibroblast in the Leucete actually change into bone cells. And bone cells are called what? Osteoblasts and osteocytes. And so here's a typical bone cell. It has cell membrane extensions called canaliculi, and they will actually be getting their food from blood vessels through these extensions, the canaliculi. So the canaliculi and the bone cells, they're just going to fill up this whole area of this Leucete membrane, and this happens only in the skull. So all the rest of the bones in the skeleton come from cartilaginous or hyaline cartilage CT baby bones, right, fetal bones. And so the type of growth that's going to come from cartilage is called osteogenesis. So osteogenesis means to make bone from cartilage, bones. And so when you make bones, they have to increase in length and they have to increase in width. And so to add length to a bone, just like we did in cartilage, you're going to have to stack the cells one on top of the other with very little matrix around them. And so it's called endochondral growth. And compact bone is going to do that for all your bones. And then to add width to all of your 90% bones, spongy bone, that's going to have spaces around it, this is called interstitial growth, just like we did in the cartilage. So osteogenesis, again, means to make, to grow bone, and you got to add length, you got to add width. And so when you add length by stacking the cells, endochondral, and when you make more matrix and have spaces around it, it's called interstitial growth. So over here, I drew a picture, and this is a bone that's developing. It used to be cartilage, but because growth hormone is coming in here, it's going to change the cartilage into a slab of bone, okay? And so growth hormone, GH, will be coming in your arteries to help change the fibroblast and the cartilage cells that used to be there. All right, so now here is a picture of a little baby bone, a soft bone, and basically there's two areas in here. There's going to be this area going around the edge, outside edge, and then a middle area that has a big space in it. So over here, we're going to look at this. First of all, we want simple squamous and dense reg CT, and it's going to go all the way around the outside to give it the shape to the bone, okay? And we call that the periosteum. In cartilage, it was called perichondrium. And so basically, that's going to give it shape. And over here, what goes through the periosteum is a set of blood vessels. And so we're going to have an artery come in, turn into a capillary, go out as a vein. And of course, nerves will go into the periosteum also. Now, the periosteum right here is going to have a little area where some arteries are going to grow out of it. And so we have two arteries that are going to go all the way around the outside underneath the periosteum. And we're going to have two veins that also develop right in this area at the capillary. And these veins are going to go all the way around like a railroad track, okay? And then we're going to have a connector blood vessel right here, connector blood vessel. And so we have to name these BVs that are underneath the periosteum. So here is the periosteum, the purple and the orange, and here are the sets of blood vessels going around underneath the capsule. All right, so what do we call the blood vessels here that go around and make like the railroad track right there? The two that are parallel to each other. These are called haversian artery and vein. So they're named the same thing. So this set right here and this set right here, those are going to be the haversians, okay? Haversians, artery and vein, haversians. And then we have connectors between the two. And the connectors are called Volkmanns right over here. So I put connector, BV, the Volkmann, artery, and vein. All right, and now once you have these blood vessels underneath the periosteum, then bone cells can start to grow. And so bone cells will start to grow in circles. And so all these brown circles are areas of nice, compact, dense bone. And it grows in circles around the blood vessels so it can get its food from the blood vessels right there, okay? And so it goes all the way around, and I drew some here and here and then here. So I didn't fill in the whole picture, but that is circular bone cells growing in circles around the blood vessels, the haversian and Volkmann. So now if we go way over here, we have a name for all of this. So the bone is called compact or dense bone right here. It grows in circles around the three blood vessels, around these blood vessels. And so the blood vessels are haversians, artery and vein. There's two of those and one Volkmann, the connector, okay? And so all of this, the compact dense bone and the BVs, all the blood vessels, we call this a haversian system or an osteon, okay? An osteon or haversian system for all of this underneath your periosteum right here. All right, then in the middle of the bone, right here, we have a loose CT membrane coming around, and then it goes around the space, like a cavity. It's a space in the middle, and that is called, this loose CT is called the endosteum. And what's going to be in here in this space, dead center in the bone? Well, first of all, we've got bone cells that are growing in here. And they're like little islands of bone. And so here they are, the bone, and that's called spongy bone because there's a lot of space between these individual osteocytes and blasts. And so now these are all spongy bone areas, and I put them in here, spongy bone. And then the loose CT is going to make blood for this cavity. And so the loose CT will make your blood cells and the matrix, which is called plasma. So that's where you get blood from, is the loose CT in the bone marrow cavity. So we call all of this area right here, it's called bone marrow cavity, right up there, the bone marrow cavity, or you can call it the medullary cavity, right, medullary cavity. And so basically, I guess I put it twice so I can erase it. And so there you go, bone marrow cavity or medullary cavity. Medullary means in the middle of anything, a solid organ, the area in the middle, right there. So bone marrow is very common. Now, as you get older, they actually call this, when it fills up with fat, you can have fat replace the blood cells and the plasma. And when you get a lot of fat in here, it's called yellow marrow. And when it's young and making a lot of good fresh blood and a lot of good cells, bone cells, it's called red bone marrow. So they always refer to it as either red or yellow. And on the handout you have with the skulls, there's a picture taken from your lab book, and it actually shows you yellow bone marrow, and then it shows you the different areas, spongy bone, compact bone, everything. So you might want to look at that also, because it's a much better picture. All right, so now, once we got this, the loose CT called endosteum. It's going to make basically your blood right here. And do we have a term for making blood, which means cells and plasma? Yes. And so to make blood cells, it's called hemopoiesis. Hemopoiesis means to make blood. All right, and every type of bone makes blood, has hemopoiesis. Even the skull bones, they all have bone marrow cavities in them, but it just develops differently than in your other bones, your cartilage bones. All right, then at the ends of the bone marrow cavity, there's a little pad right here, and these are cartilage cells, hyaline cartilage CT cells, and so these are called growth plates. And so the real name for growth plate is epiphyseal plate. Epiphysis means the ends of a bone or the head of the bone, and so epiphyseal growth plate. And so it's made out of hyaline cartilage CT, and when you have one on one end, it's called proximal epiphyseal plate. And then if you have another one, you always will have a second one, then you're going to call it the distal epiphyseal plate. So those are your growth plates that are going to continue to grow and get bigger, and that will add length to your bones, okay? All of your bones will have two growth plates to add the length to them. All right, so now what else? We also have on the ends of movable bones, we also have an articulating cartilage pad or disc, and that's usually made out of hyaline or fibrous cartilage. It's protective so that your bones, your periosteum and your compact bone, it doesn't rub against each other. And so on both ends of the bone, there should be a cartilage pad. And articulating means movable. So when that wears out, that's how arthritis develops, when bone is rubbing against bone, which is very painful, actually. All right, so now I think I've covered most everything except for one more thing. Now I'm going to talk about this cell that's in your capillary right here, and it's going to come out and it actually goes and eats up your bone cells. It'll come and eat up your bone cells in the bone marrow cavity, and it will come out and eat it up out here in the dense bone area, the dense compact bone. And so what is the name of this famous cell that's going to eat up your old cartilage and bone cells? Well, over here, I think I'll put it over here, right here. And so we're going to call this cell right here, it's called a osteoclast. Osteoclast. And so what is an osteoclast? I'm going to put it right here, make us another one over here. So this is called an osteoclast or a chondroclast. And what is this? Well, basically it's a white blood cell called a monocyte. A monocyte, and it eats old cartilage and bone cells. Cartilage and bone cells. So you can basically make fresh matrix. So you can then reproduce new cells, and get fresh matrix. Fresh matrix right there. Okay, so this eats cartilage and it eats bone. It comes out of your capillary and it goes up and it starts eating on the bone cells or even on cartilage. It'll come over and it can come and eat cartilage also. And so you basically get a new skeleton about every 2 years. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean all your bones disappear. It just means that you get fresh matrix laid on top of the old matrix where these cells were eating away, okay? So that's how that will work. So you get a new skeleton about every 2 years from ages 18 to about 60, okay? After that, it takes longer for these cells to basically work that fast. So that basically summarizes a growing piece of bone doing osteogenesis. And I also have a couple other terms. I have epiphysis, which means the head area. And then I have diaphysis, which is also a bone marking term, which means the shaft, the area between the epiphysis. So epiphysis means head. So most bones have 2 heads to them. So that's a summary of how bones grow.